I'd do a little different video today. As you can probably tell, I kind of like books, and I thought I'd talk about some of the most influential books for me as a composer. Now, you would think that I'm going to be talking mostly about music books, and what I've decided to do is split it 50-50. 50% music books, 50% literature. So let's go ahead and start out with the music books. What I will say is probably the most important music book for me as a composer is this, Berlioz's Treatise on Instrumentation, updated by Richard Strauss. Influential for a number of reasons. One, both Berlioz and Strauss are more or less composer heroes of mine. I love all of their music. But the other thing is this is one of the few texts on the different instruments, on the orchestra, that really focuses on potential. They're not only talking about what the instruments in the orchestra, the instruments themselves, have done in the past, which is very important for a composer to know, but they're also talking about what they can do in the future. And it's that forward-looking aspect that I find as a composer to be so influential. Yes, the main text is 160 years out of date. Strauss's updates are 115 years out of date. But the ideas are still relevant. In fact, I can point to maybe the single most influential page in the text. It's page 408. And it is the text where Berlioz describes his ideal orchestra. Now, this is not actually his ideal orchestra. This is an orchestra he dreamed of for a giant music festival where all sorts of musicians got together. But it's not the size of the orchestra that is so influential to me. It's the few paragraphs that follow where he talks about how to combine instruments. And this half a page of text, for me, is some of the most influential music writing that I have ever come across. I'll read a couple paragraphs. By dividing the violoncellos and the double basses in the low range and in slow movements, melancholy religious expression in mezzo forte. He talks about the technique, the tempo, the style, the dynamic in one sentence. And he conveys this great text. Let's go on to a piece of literature now. So for my first piece of literature, I'm actually going with not one book, but a whole collection of books. And I'm looking at basically the collected works of John Ronald Reuel Tolkien. It's Lord of the Rings, especially the Silmarillion. And one of the aspects that I absolutely truly love is the world building. World building is, for me, the most difficult craft in writing. How are you going to populate and create this new world that you're creating that will only exist on the page? And to me, no one does it better than Tolkien. As a composer, I do the same thing. If I'm looking at a symphony, I am world building. I have to go in and think of every detail possible. Tolkien started his world building with the languages. I start mine with the instruments. And you build from there. I build from what the instruments can do, what they're capable of, and then creating a whole sound world out of that. And I get so much inspiration going back and reading Tolkien. Let's go back to another music book. This is perhaps one of the books that I've had in my collection the longest. It's Anthony Bain's Woodwind Instruments and Their History. And I remember when I got this book, it was before I even started learning to play bassoon. So it had to have been Christmas 1991 or 92. So I've had this book getting close to 30 years. And I don't even need to open it anymore. I've read it so many times. I've basically got it memorized. But I'll go back and it's everything that I want to know about the woodwind instruments up until the time it was printed in about the 1950s. And we'll get to that in a little bit. But this being really the first true music book I got, other than I think a music dictionary that just introduced me to all the music terms, is I learned all the instruments that were out there. I learned what they do, what role they serve. And this book has really formed a lot of my earliest, and still to this day, ideas about woodwind instruments and just writing music in general. Next, let's go back to literature. And when somebody asks me what my favorite book is, I'm not going to say any music book, but I will go back and forth between Tolkien and Melville, Moby-Dick. And this one, I have a feeling a lot of people will have bad high school memories of. Say, oh, they forced me to read Moby-Dick in high school. And it's like, yeah, but go back and read it as an adult. My God, this book is absolutely amazing. The language in it, it's like being fed beautiful poetry. And I made sure to get, the most beautiful copy I could get. And this stays on display in my living room at all times. But I think I've read this book 2.5 times now. And I'll just, start reading it at some point in there. And just like, oh. It's just the poetry, the language. It's the same kind of creative aspect that I think a composer does. In fact, there's a chapter in here called The Symphony. So that should tell you something. And it's just, I just find this to be an amazingly well-written, well-thought-out piece of literature. I know it is not going to be for a lot of people's taste, but I absolutely love this middle romantic era where it's just highs and lows and this just huge amount of symbolism. God, I love the symbolism in here. All right, back to music. And let's talk a little bit about Arnie, Arnold Schoenberg. This was a challenge for me to pick out a book off of my shelves for music to fill in another spot. This is Fundamentals of Musical Composition by Arnold Schoenberg. And this book that I read years ago, and I'm going to reread it again in the next couple days, actually, just to refresh myself. But it is where I really grasped the ideas of musical form. And Schoenberg, you may not like his music. In fact, I actually really love his music. Go Team Girl Leader. But he was a phenomenal teacher. There are several books on how to become a great composer. And if you read those, you should have a full understanding of the language of writing music. And not just music of Schoenberg's style, the 12-tone, but he is so well versed in music history, music composition, music craft that you're hard pressed to find someone who could outdo him. So if you really want to get into the ideas of music form, music function, The Fundamentals of Music Composition by Arnold Schoenberg. And now for something a little bit lighter. Harry Potter. Hear me out on this one. I really love the Harry Potter series. I think these are some of the most charming, well-written, well-rounded books that I have ever read. And I tip my hat to J.K. Rowling that about character creation. I have read no author who is better at creating memorable and lovable characters than J.K. Rowling. And I say that these books are so popular and so well known that I think a lot of people forget the kind of quality that's in them. The structure behind them, symbolism, the levels of complexity that people are still figuring out some of the really deeper meanings behind these 20 years on. That says a lot to the craft here. It's fantastic world building. Go Ravenclaw. Back to music book. And I'm going to go Norman Del Mar, Anatomy of the Orchestra. This is a fantastic book and should be in every composer's library, in every conductor's library, and every performer's library. Del Mar breaks down what is expected of an orchestra, of every player in the orchestra, of the conductor. He talks about all the weird stuff that has happened in the past, the stuff that might happen. He breaks down every instrument, their role, the weirdness that they might encounter. As far as an orchestration text, it may not be a true orchestration text, but man, is this important to have on your shelf. Anatomy of the Orchestra by Norman Del Mar. Let's go old school. In fact, let's go as old school as you can go. The Epic of Gilgamesh, the oldest piece of literature in human history, ranking in at nearly 5,000 years old from ancient Sumeria. This was the subject of the first large-scale symphonic composition that I ever wrote and had performed. I had the gumption in undergrad to assemble a 65-piece orchestra together to form a 45-minute long tone poem. Somehow I pulled it off. I think I still owe people favors for that. However many years ago, 14, 15 years ago. But this early piece of literature really changed a lot of my ways of thinking. It opened up new thoughts, new possibilities, and I'll go back and reread it now, and it's like, oh man, this is good stuff for being as old as it is. You know, it doesn't show its age very, as well as, I butchered that, but it doesn't show its age at all. All right, before I get to the last music book, let's do one more piece of literature. And, well, I'm going with an author this time rather than a single book, but if I am feeling down and depressed and just want to laugh, Mark Twain and The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. And I've read this 2 or 3 times now, and every time I read it, I get deeper and deeper into it. But Mark Twain, one of the most insightful human beings who's ever lived, and one of the funniest. I remember when I was teaching English one year, I read his short story, How to Tell a Story, and I gave all the students a copy of it. And at the end, he's got this great passage where he's telling a ghost story and says, if you pause right here and do exactly this, you will get a little girl to scream. Now, I had this in front of every student. They were reading along. I did exactly what he said. I read aloud what he said, and I still got a little girl to scream, and it was one of the most proud moments I've ever had as a teacher. But I've also always had a huge connection to the Mississippi River, and maybe one day I will put that into music. But Mark Twain, I think I've read nearly everything he's written, like 20-something books. Even the really bad one, like Tom Sawyer Detective. Finally, if we're talking influential books on me as a composer, this is not going to be a vanity thing. It is simply the fact that when you sit down to write 2 giant texts that take the greater part of 2 years to do, these become influential to you. I learned more writing these 2, this 900 pages worth of text or more, than I would have learned in any other book. And that's maybe one of the takeaways. If you want to learn something, teach it, write it. I've still got 2 more of these to go. I'll be dead by the time they're finished. I've also wanted to do second editions. But I think that may give you a window a little bit into my working mind as a composer, as an author, as a reader. Let me know, what are the most influential books for you as a performer, as a musician, as a composer, as whatever you do? So I'm interested to know. Leave a comment down below. What books are influential to you? And until next time.